Good morning and welcome to today's session of the course History of English Language and Literature. In today's session, we begin to look at the starting points of English literary history. In that sense, the discussion is going to be mostly on how and when the history of English literature began. Let's try and locate the beginnings in terms of a socio-political history. So, this is how these were the early inhabitants of England if we try to give a chronological and a sequential sense of it. They were initially the Celts, who were also Britons and Gales. They were initially the Celts, which included the Britons and the Gales. In fact, incidentally, the name Briton has emerged from the tribe called Britons. And the Celts inhabited England up to 55 BC. And we find the Roman conquest happening from 55 BC till about 407 AD. Then the Anglo-Saxon invasions happened from 407 AD and last until the 787 AD. And there are the Viking invasions, which is also a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon period. This happens from 787 AD to 1066 AD. And with 1066 AD, we find the beginning of the Norman Conquest and also the end of the Old English period. So, if we try and classify this period, I have also coined an acronym to make you remember the sequential order of various inhabitants in the island of England: CRAVN, Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and the Normists. So, in certain ways, some of the historians, as we noted in the earlier lecture, there is a lot of debate about the starting point of English literary history. Some argue that the English literary history can only begin from 1066 AD onwards with the Norman Conquest, but some are also of the opinion that we need to trace back the history from the Anglo-Saxon times onwards, because that is where the Old English literature is located, and it is very important to get a sense of national heritage and the starting points of the story of England and the story of literature. And some are of the opinion that one needs to go back from the time of the Celtic inhabitants onwards. So, here we begin the story of England and the story of English literature from the time of the Celtic migration to this island that we now know as England. So, from the 5th century onwards, we find a massive migration of Celts and Gales to this particular island. And we also note that this island was repeatedly invaded by Romans, because Rome was the most dominant empire and the most dominant military force of the time. But this was not a very aggressive kind of invasion, because we find that by 55 BC and later by the 1st century AD, Romans are quite successful in establishing a system of governance in this Celtic England. And this was not through any violent or aggressive means, because there is a lot of evidence to show that there was a kind of peaceful coexistence between the Celts and the Romans during that time. In fact, their military camps were not really the camps of the later nature. The military camps led to the emergence of towns, mostly Romanized towns in England, and they also ensured that a good infrastructure was in place. So, in that sense, the military presence helped a lot in maintaining peace in the island of England during the Celtic times. So, what were the implications of this? The details of the influence of Latin language, and later on how Christianity made a comeback even after the Romans had left England. All of these we shall be taking a detailed look at when we talk about the implications of when we talk about the evolution of language from the Celtic period onwards. What's very important for us to note at this point is that the original inhabitants of England, this island that we now know as England, were the Celts. So, in that sense, the story of English begins even before the arrival of the English people at a later point of time from the Anglo-Saxon time onwards. So, the Anglo-Saxon period, which is also known as the Old English period, this begins after the Romans. So, at the outset, it is important to note that the term England, the nation, gets the name from Angleland, which later evolved into England. So, we begin with the Anglo-Saxon period after the withdrawal of the Roman legions from the land of England. Why were the Romans forced to leave? This was in fact they had a very practical reason to withdraw their legions from the island of England. Visigoths, a very violent Germanic invading tribe, they were attacking Rome, and Rome had to withdraw its legions from England in order to defend its own home soil. So, we find that by AD 407, all the Roman legions are withdrawn from Britain. And at this point, we find that curiously enough, England is in a very vulnerable stage. They are open to attack, they are defenseless because they did not have, the Celts did not have any kind of an army to defend themselves. They had heavily relied on the protection and on all kinds of guidance which they had been receiving from the Roman army. So, as we had noted earlier, this peaceful coexistence also had offered a lot of protection to their Celts, because those were the times when the invading tribes could come and land on any fertile soil, and they could even usurp the land and overthrow the original inhabitants from any land. So, the Celts received a lot of protection from all of these attacks due to the presence of the Roman army. So, once they leave, they are under attack, and we find these sets of tribes from different areas invading them, and the two important of those tribes were the Picts and the Scots, who arrives in the land of England from the north and also from Ireland. So, we find that England is under a severe attack at this point of time. In fact, it is at this juncture that the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes arrive in order to protect England from the impending attack of the Picts and the Scots. So, historians, many historians feel that the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes together arrived in England initially as mercenaries from the eastern coast of Europe, and they were quite welcomed in the beginning by the Celts, because the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes also offered a kind of defense against the invading tribes Picts and Scots. So, in that sense, Celts in fact made a very strategic political mistake. They were using the help of one set of invading tribes to defend themselves against another set of invading tribes. So, we find that over a period of time, the Angles, Jutes and the Saxons who arrived from these eastern coasts of Europe, they come and begin to settle in this island, find them quite spread across the land of England, across Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia and Wessex. So, there is a clear domination of all of these tribes put together, the Angles, Jutes and Saxons in this island of Britain. So, when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were invading England, was there any resistance against the Anglo-Saxons? We shall be giving an answer to this very shortly. And as we move on, it is important to note that these were invading Germanic tribes. This information is very important at the outset in order to understand how Germanic inflections were built into English language at a later stage. So, the original inhabitants, the Celts, who were living with the support of the Romanized army, they are now being driven to the mountain areas in Wales. So, we find that as and when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes defend the Celts against the attack of Picts and Scots, they also end up driving out the original inhabitants of the island. And so, this was in fact, after that what follows is a national migration of the Anglo-Saxons into the island of Britain. And this, some historians feel that this was mostly an invasion and partly a migration. But however, from this point of time, we note that the Celts are no longer seen in the area of Britain, but they have been completely displaced and they have been completely won over by the Anglo-Saxons. So, what made this possible? In the sense that why were the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes coming over to England and overthrowing the native population and also establishing their settlements over there? Many historians have given various reasons for this, but some of the more convincing reasons are about the fertile soil that England had at that point of time. And it was also considered quite safer than rest of the Europe, because the Europe had not yet emerged into the civilized nation states that it is now comprised of. It was mostly under attack by many invading tribes. So, all these tribes were on the lookout for a safe place where they could build their civilization and also lead a peaceful life through agriculture. So, England offered almost all of these things, since it was based, since England was mostly an island, it also offered a protection from many of these invading tribes. So, we find the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes settling in this island, and at a later point we even find that we hear only about the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes are nowhere to be found in later stage. At this point, it is also the time for us to give an answer to the question, whether there was any kind of resistance offered when the Anglo-Saxons began their attack. So, this is the time to perhaps introduce this figure of King Arthur. The historicity of King Arthur is much debated. He is said to have lived during the 5th and the early 6th century BC, and he is said to have united the Celtic inhabitants of that time. And it's also said that he had led defense of Britain against the Anglo-Saxon invaders, and obviously he ends up losing it as well. We find a lot of legends and folklores about King Arthur in mostly in the medieval histories. And also at a later point we find it, especially in the 1130s, we find this writer Geoffrey of Monmouth creating a literary persona of King Arthur. But at the same time, whether King Arthur actually lived or whether this is just a fictional creation is a much debated and a much contested issue of literary history. And some even argue that maybe he is a half forgotten Celtic deity who was worshipped during those times, because we do not find any mention of King Arthur in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is perhaps the most important historical document of the Anglo-Saxon times, and we do not find him being mentioned later in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People either. So, in that sense, one is not very sure of the historicity of King Arthur, but at the same time, the stories about King Arthur offer a lot of insights about the lives during the Celtic times and also the life of England even before the English people or the Anglo-Saxons arrived in England. So, what did the Anglo-Saxons do after they arrived in this island? We find that they had in mind a proper kind of a settlement. So, they went on to establish 5 kingdoms, which are also known as the Heptarchy. The 5 kingdoms being Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex and Kent. And in terms of the language that evolved during that time, there were 4 main dialects: Northumbrian, which was incidentally also the first one to produce any kind of oral literature, and there was Mercian, Kentish and West Saxon. And later on we find that West Saxon gets more supremacy than the others because of the political supremacy of Wessex, and also because this was the language that King Alfred, about whom we will be hearing about very shortly, and this being the language of political supremacy and the language that King Alfred used. And we find the dialect West Saxon becoming more important than all the others. And we also note that many of the extant texts that we have in the contemporary, they are also preserved in this dialect of the West Saxon. And in terms of literature, which we shall be taking a detailed look at in the later sessions, poetry flourished mostly in the north and prose was available mostly in the south. And when we talk about literature of these times, it was not always about written literature, but it was also about the oral traditions which were prevalent during those times. So, this is also perhaps the time to take a look at who King Alfred the Great was. He is always mentioned as King Alfred the Great in literary and political history. He was the king of Wessex. If we take a quick look again at this map, Wessex was the most important one, but also Wessex was kind of a leader who could bring together all the other kingdoms and the provinces. So, we find King Alfred being the king of Wessex from 871 to 899, and he in fact successfully could unite the rest of the kingdoms and the rest of the provinces under his supremacy. And he was very important in the political history of England because he had led the British army against the Viking invasions. Vikings were a group of very ruthless and very violent invaders who were quite dreaded during that time. We find that they were usually always associated with war, with conquest, and their violence was quite notorious during that time. So, Britain being this land which was very fertile, which was safe, which was also quite a fertile land in establishing proper kind of settlements, Vikings continuously invaded Britain. We find that during the Anglo-Saxon period itself, the Vikings invaded twice, one in 787 and the second one in 866. There is a third one about which we shall be hearing quite shortly. And in 866, we find that a Viking army had descended in this area of East Anglia and it also advanced to Wessex. But we find that King Alfred had successfully driven out all the Vikings from that area because he could unite the kingdoms, all the kingdoms against the attack of the Vikings. And if you note, all the kingdoms were quite aware of the threat that the Vikings had posed to them. So, in that sense, it was easier as well for King Alfred to unite them politically and also come up with an army to attack them. And in the available records later on, we find it, though King Alfred was primarily the king of Wessex, he styles himself as a king of the Anglo-Saxons, because there is no other figure that we see in the Old English period who was capable of uniting all the kingdoms together and who was capable of assuming this political and other kinds of status that serves a king. So, he not only united England, but he also had given a new code of conduct for them to abide with, and he is also the one who encouraged education, art, literature, etc. during the Old English period. So, meanwhile, there are these other kinds of developments that happen politically. In 876, we find that Britain falls into the hands of Danes for a brief time, and this is Danes were the group of tribes that attacked England primarily from Denmark and Norway. And there were many invasions from 1003 till 1013, and during this time we find that the Danes end up occupying most of the land in Britain, and here we can see in the map that most of Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria all had fallen into the hands of the Danes. So, this also led to something that we now know as Dane law. Dane law emerged in the areas that were occupied by the Danes. So, in fact, after King Alfred, we do not even find any kind of a single person who was capable of uniting all the Anglo-Saxons together. So, this had also made the Anglo-Saxons and the land of Britain quite vulnerable to a lot of attack. But though the Danes were successful in establishing a code of conduct, establishing what we now call as the Danes law in almost half of Britain, we find that they did not have any worthy successors. So, at a later point of time, we also note that the Danish rule and the prevalence of the Danes law ends by 1066. But it is of much curiosity and interest to know that some of the legal terms that survived from the Danes laws period has survived into the modern English as well. These details we shall be taking a look at when we talk about the evolution of language from the Old English period onwards. So, what exactly marked the end of Anglo-Saxon period? It was certainly not the Danish occupation. There was another bigger event which had to follow after that, and this also noted the end of not just the Anglo-Saxon period, but we also simultaneously find the end of the Viking invasions and the end of Viking age as well. And from 1066 AD with the Norman Conquest, we find not just England, but also Europe entering a new phase in history, in literature, so on and so forth, because most of these invading tribes, we do not hear about them from this point onwards. So, this is how the turn of events were like. In 1066 AD, there was initially this battle of Stamford, in which England successfully defeated a Norwegian army. Norwegians were also a kind of invading tribes who could also be classified among the Vikings, and the Battle of Stamford was successfully defended by the then Danish king. But at the same time, we find that this success was very short-lived, because in less than 3 weeks there was an attack from the Normans, and in this England gets defeated, and this changes the history of England forever. And many historians feel that England was quite unprepared for this attack, because they had just survived a war and they did not have enough time to come up with the resources or even try and prepare for an attack against the Normans. So, Norman Conquest is also known as the Battle of Hastings. This marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon age, and it marked the beginning of the Norman rule and French influence in England. So, this is how Norman Conquest happened in 1066 AD. Seeing that England was quite weak under the then Danish ruler, as we noted earlier, the Danish were not worthy of preserving their throne because the successors were quite weak. So, William the Conqueror from Normandy in France, he identified that there is a potential through which he could become the king of England. So, he launches this attack from France. William of Normandy, he arrives in Kent, which is also known as Hastings. He arrives from Normandy in France, and he defeated Harold Godwinson, the then Danish ruler. Incidentally, he also happens to be the last Anglo-Saxon king that we hear of, because the death of Harold Godwinson and also Norman Conquest marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule. And this event is very important politically, geographically and also linguistically, because from then on, from 1066 AD, with the Norman Conquest, we begin to see a Norman French influence on England. We find that the Germanic influence that the Anglo-Saxons had brought in earlier, it begins to fade away, and the Norman French influence begins to stay on. In that sense, French also becomes the official language, displacing the Old English language of the Anglo-Saxons, and we also find this event marking an end of the Anglo-Saxon dominance in all ways. So, which is why historians debate a lot about which could be the starting point of English history and English literature, whether we begin talking about the Anglo-Saxon period or do we begin talking about the Norman Conquest onwards. But in this course, we've given due attention to the Old English literature as well, and also we've marked the ways in which this transition has been enabled after the Norman Conquest. So, just to make this a little easier for you, there are these set of events that lead up to the Norman Conquest in 1066 AD, which will also enable us to understand that there was no way in which the Anglo-Saxons could have resisted the invasion of the Normans. On 20th September, we find this Battle of Fulford happening. There are a lot of these, as we mentioned earlier itself, there are a lot of these invading tribes who were continuing to attack Britain because it was a fertile land, also because Britain was safer than Europe. On 25th September, again in 1066 itself, we find the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold defeats the invading Norwegian tribes and he is successful over here. But at the same time, within 3 days, we find that William of Normandy, he lands in this province known as Pevensey, and though Harold and his army comes to know about this, there is very little time for him to organize an attack and come all the way to the south to launch an attack against William of Normandy's army. And we find that gradually by 14th October, there's this battle of Hastings which happens, and William successfully outdoes Harold in all ways, because there was not enough time to again come up with an army after this Battle of Stamford on 25th September. So, we do find that there is very little time and very little resources available to launch another attack. And as we move on to see the other turn of events, by mid-October, William is repulsed, and we also find that by the end of October, all the English leaders, they submit to the authority of William of Normandy. And by late October, we find there is this one province which was descending under this ruler Steigen. We find him also submitting after this Battle of Wallingford. And by the end of December, by the end of 1066 AD, we find the inevitable happening. William of Normandy is crowned as the King of Britain. And this also marks the beginning of the Norman Conquest and the beginning of the Norman French influence into English culture, English language, English literature, English social life, and almost everything that has come to define England from that time onwards. So, as we come to the end of today's session, it is very important for us to note that the Battle of Hastings or the Norman Conquest of 1066 marked the beginning of Middle English period. And this is of supreme importance to our understanding, because in a certain way, the history of English literature also, as some historians argue, it begins properly with the beginning of the Middle English period. But however, as we noted earlier on itself, language and literature began to evolve from the Old English period onwards. So, in that sense, we also need to take a closer look at the kind of literature that had begun to emerge from the Old English period onwards. So, in the next lecture, we shall be taking a look at the poetry and prose that began to emerge during the Old English period, which will also get a clearer understanding about how literature was fashioned during that times, and also how literature served as a window to understand the various socio-political happenings of the period. With this, we come to an end of this lecture. Thank you for listening and look forward to see you in the next session.